So for this video, I'm going to talk about my favorite novellas of all time. And if you know me, I love me some novellas. Also, if you're wondering, there's not going to be any Stephen King novellas in this video. I have a whole heap of series of videos where I go deep dive into my favorite Stephen King novellas. And I do have my top 10 Stephen King novellas video that I'll link down below. So no Stephen King for this video, but a lot of my favorite authors of all time have all written some fantastic novellas that I'm going to chat about with you guys in this video. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first off, there's definitely a good amount of novellas that I don't own physically that I'm going to mention right off the bat before I forget. A recent read of mine was Ogres by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And Tchaikovsky he's written so many books. Like, he has a bunch of novels and novellas that I really need to get to. Ogres has definitely been one of my favorites, if not my favorite. This was a 4-star novella. It's one of those things where, like, you think you know what's going on, and then you get to the next chapter, you're like, oh, okay, this is what's going on. And then you keep getting further and further, you're like, wait a minute, what is happening? It's really good, and I highly recommend it if you just want something very out there and very different, which basically is what Tchaikovsky is all about. Also, one of my all-time favorite sci-fi authors did kind of an Audible exclusive novella. I'm calling it a novella just because it's like 4 hours long. It's called No Kindness Too Soon. And like I said, Novell is just one of my all-time favorite sci-fi authors. He wrote the Themis Files trilogy, which is probably my personal favorite trilogy of all time. And I didn't really look up anything about this novella going into it. I just kind of assumed that it was going to be sci-fi, and it is. And like with a lot of Sylvain Deville stuff, this was full cast narration, really intriguing story, and I just quickly fell in love with it. And it's one that I'll probably be going back to again and again just because it's super short. Very good. I gave this one 5 stars, and yeah, I loved it. Also, you know, I'm going to talk about some other ones, but I'm talking about Sylvain Deville, so I might as well talk about his other really good novella, The Test. And this one I do own in paperback. It's very short. It's barely over 100 pages. This one, let's see if I can just read the back for you, because I don't want to give too much away with any of these, because they're novellas and they're already pretty short. So the back of this says, Britain, the not-so-distant future. Ider is sitting the British citizenship test. He wants his family to belong. 25 questions to determine the worth of a life. 25 chances to impress. When the test takes an unexpected and tragic turn, Ider is handed the power of life and death. But how do you value another person's life when all you have is multiple choice? So it's definitely kind of dystopian, and it's very short, and it involves basically a guy kind of taking a citizenship test when a lot of stuff goes wrong and things go down. Very good. Check it out. I also wanted to mention Brandon Sanderson. My main love for him is Stormlight and his novels, but he has written a few novellas that take place in the Cosmere that are really good. Perfect example is The Emperor's Soul. I have not read this one in quite a long time, but it was very good. And of course, it was a novella, and I read it in one sitting. I think he won a Hugo Award for this, which is kind of funny because I don't think he's really won any major awards for like his, you know, like Stormlight books or his other Cosmere novels. But this one definitely is a lot of people's favorite for a reason. Very compelling, very easy to get through, and I think it takes place kind of in the same world as Elantris, which, you know, I think is very underrated. So it was interesting to get kind of a different spin on that, and very good. It's one that I don't actually remember too much about, so I definitely want to go back and reread it eventually. But yeah, I remember it being very good. And then he's written some other novellas. He's written 2 Stormlight novellas. One of them I'm kind of indifferent about, but another one that came out a few years ago that I really did enjoy is Dawn Shard. And this one is fun. I think it takes place between book 3 and 4, and it follows one of my all-time favorite Stormlight characters, Lopin, the crazy one-armed Herdazian. If you've read Stormlight, you know who that is, and it's just a lot of fun. I guess I can't really go into too much detail about what it's about, but It involves basically a couple of Stormlight characters kind of going off on a separate journey, and then, you know, again, I can't talk too much about it because it's like deep into the series, but it's really fun. It's really short, which, you know, even for a Stormlight novella, it's kind of long because it's like almost 300 pages. Sanderson just can't help himself, right? But it's really fun. I think it definitely adds a little bit to the story. Sometimes novellas, you read them and you're just like, what was even the point of that? But for Stormlight, you know, it's a lot of fun. I will say that. Dawn Shard is a lot of fun. And then my personal favorite author of all time is actually George R. R. Martin. A lot of y'all probably think it's Stephen King because I make a lot of Stephen King content, but in reality, my favorite is still George R. R. Martin. You know, after I read A Song of Ice and Fire, he became my second favorite author, and then I went back and read all of his stuff from the 70s and 80s, which is a lot of just really good sci-fi and horror stuff, and he quickly became my favorite. And, you know, a reason why, well, one of them why, is Night Flyers. Really cool, just really dark sci-fi novella. It's basically about this, how do I even describe this? It's people on this spaceship, and they're trying to look for this just giant intergalactic beast. And this beast kind of, when they pass over different planets, weird, like unexplained phenomena starts to happen to the planet, and no one's ever really seen this creature, and they're trying to go look for it, and crazy stuff happens. I don't want to go too much into detail, but it's really good. He also has a lot of other novellas. Like this is probably my favorite, but he's got other ones like Sand Kings, A Song for Leah. He's just everything that he's written. I mean, he's my favorite author, but basically everything he's written is just so compelling and unlike anything that I've ever read. But Night Flyers is probably my favorite of like his 70s and 80s sci-fi stuff. Also for George, I mentioned A Song of Ice and Fire, my all-time favorite series. That one actually does have some novellas, and that would be the Duncan Egg novellas, and they were all collected, well, all three of them are connected in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. So, what are the three novellas called? You've got The Hedge Knight, which is the first one, and then, oh god, I should have looked this up before. The second one is The Sworn Sword, and then the third one is called The Mystery Knight. And all of these kind of take place about 100 or so years before the events of the first book. And they're kind of written in a different tone. So like A Song of Ice and Fire, you know, is kind of grimdarky, kind of inspired the grimdark movement of fantasy. But for these ones, it's kind of written in more of a classic sense where like you've got this good character and they're trying their best to be good and do good things. And it's kind of got more of that classic feel to it. So it's definitely a good example of George writing something that's not just A Song of Ice and Fire. It does have some interesting nods to A Song of Ice and Fire, obviously. But yeah, it's really good. I would say it's not quite as good as actually A Song of Ice and Fire, but definitely worth reading if you're like me and you're waiting for Winds of Winter and you haven't checked this one out. Maybe this will tide you over. And speaking of fantasy, one of the more recent fantasy novellas that I read, which I really enjoyed, was Requiem for a Star by Eugene Gutman. And if you recognize that name, that's the same guy who wrote Winds of Strife, which in my opinion is one of the better fantasy debuts that I've ever read. I'm eagerly awaiting for the second book, which hopefully will come out eventually, no pressure, but that book was really good. And then this is kind of a prequel novella, but at the same time, you don't have to have read Winds of Strife to read this book. For example, my wife, who's never read Winds of Strife, she read this book first and thoroughly enjoyed it. We both gave it 4.5 stars. It's really good. And yeah, definitely highly recommend it. I'll read the back of it here. It says, "Before the voices, before vengeance and blood and lies, Nye was just a boy. A curly-haired boy, shy and kind of cute. Nero was his name back then, and he wasn't alone. He had me. Hi, I'm Nova. Pleased to meet you. I'm not a fan of small talk, so here's what you need to know. I'm 17, I like books, and swimming, and jewelry, and asking weird questions that put people on the spot. My biggest fear is having no one to talk to. And my biggest dream is that people will listen to what I have to say. Requiem for a Star is my story, how I met Nero, what I learned from him, what I did, what I fought. It's a bittersweet love story, tiny bit sexy, revolving around magic, loss, philosophy, beauty, and hugs. Lots of hugs. And yeah, it's just really good. It's definitely a cool way. It's cool either way. Like if you've read Winds of Strife, you get a lot out of it. But if you haven't read it before, it's still a fun way to start the series. So highly recommend it for anyone who's interested. And speaking of fantasy, this next series that I have to talk about has several novellas kind of interlocked in the series. The series I'm talking about is, of course, the Song of Shattered Sands series. And of course, that starts with 12 Kings of Sherikai, one of my all-time favorite fantasy series that has 6 main novels, but it actually has 7 novellas. And a lot of the times, like I said, novellas can kind of be, you know, like not super detailed, or like they have nothing to do with the actual plot of the main story. But with these novellas, there's 7 of them. They're all really good, and they're all important in their own ways to the overarching story. And definitely by far my favorite of those novellas is The Doors of Dusk and Dawn. Or I'm sorry, The Doors at Dusk and Dawn. This one was just super compelling and not really what I was expecting. If you can tell, it's got a horse on the cover, and it's basically just about this epic, really epic horse race. And the stakes are raised because whoever wins the race gets something, and the main character really needs that something because it means a lot to them. And basically it's just the story of this really epic horse race, and it gets kind of crazy at the end, but it's just really well paced, a lot of action, a lot of really great character work, and it's just a little over 100 pages, but it works so well. It's 5 stars. It's just one of the best things, the best fantasy novellas ever written in my mind. I don't know if it would, I guess it would make sense to read it as a standalone, but still, it really adds a lot to the actual plot of the main series. Like if you've read Sherikai, but you haven't read the novellas, highly recommend it. And yeah, this is definitely one of my favorite fantasy novellas of all time. And the last 2 novellas I have to talk about, they're actually both on the horror side. There are a lot of great horror short stories and novellas. Like I mentioned, Stephen King has a bunch of them, but I've got plenty of videos talking about those. But one of my favorite horror authors of all time is Zoe Stage, and she wrote this hidden gem called The Girl Who Outgrew the World. And with a title like that, you might think like, oh, it's kind of a literary thing where like the girl is having trouble in her life and like the world is blah, blah, blah. But no, it's literally about a girl who is growing and growing, and people around her are like, what the hell is happening? Like she's just getting taller and taller, like as a little girl. And it goes into some crazy places. It's actually interesting too, because Zoe Stage before this had really only written from the female perspective, but you also get the perspective of the little girl's dad in here, which was a lot of fun to get his reactions to everything, because like he's got some wild stuff. But it's not perfect, I will say that. Like I wasn't a huge fan of the ending of this book, but it was a lot of fun nonetheless, and a really cool premise of a little girl who literally won't stop growing. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, so definitely check it out if you haven't already. And then definitely one of my favorite horror novellas of all time by one of my favorite horror authors has to be Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. Now this one, it's kind of a perfect blend of horror, creepiness, and black comedy, because this book, it does have the creepiness factor, but also it's just bonkers, which I think is really hilarious. It basically starts out with these kids trying their best to play a prank on these moviegoers at a theater with a mannequin, and then things escalate from there. It involves a mannequin. Yeah, it's really wild. It's really crazy. It's one that I really want to go back and reread because I haven't read it in a long time. But just know that if you want a wild ride, or, you know, conversely, if you want to get into Stephen Graham Jones but don't want to commit to a full novel, this one is it's like 120 pages. Check it out. You won't be disappointed if you love horror and black comedy. All right, so those are my all-time favorite novellas that I've ever read that are not Stephen King. And like I mentioned, a lot of these authors are my favorite authors of all time. So George R. R. Martin, my favorite, like he does everything well. He does novels, short stories, novellas, including the ones that I showed in here, Night Flyers and The Hedge Knight, all of those. He's fantastic. So a little biased there maybe, but also you've got Brandon Sanderson, who's obviously well known for his Cosmere novels, but he has some really good Cosmere novellas as well. And then Zoe Stage, Stephen Graham Jones, Sylvain Novelle, one of my favorite sci-fi novelists, has some really good novellas. But yeah, these are my all-time favorites, non-Stephen King novellas, if you will. All really good, and definitely let me know if you've read any of these before. Let me know if you agree with my picks here. And overall, what are your favorite novellas that are not Stephen King? But also, if you want to throw down some Stephen King novellas, I'd love to chat about that with y'all as well. And also, what did you guys think of this video? If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I've also got my Patreon link down below where you can support me for as little as $1 a month. I've also got my Amazon wish list down below if you want to support me there as well. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching and have a fantastic day.